A distant cousin of the Duchess of Cornwall who was embroiled in one of Britain's longest-running divorce battles is thought to have taken his own life in a London hotel room. Charles Villiers and estranged wife Emma Villiers hit headlines after becoming involved in a dispute over whether their divorce should be settled in Scottish or English courts. The couple separated in 2012 and filed for divorce in 2014, making their bitter marital conflict one of the longest on record, as at the time of his death it was still unresolved. The court battle spread across 5 different courts and 20 judges over 8 years, and at one point involved a police investigation into allegations of bigamy against Mrs. Villiers, claims which were later dismissed by detectives. According to The Times, the 59-year-old was found dead by a housekeeper in a room at the Durrance Hotel in London's Marylebone last week. It was also claimed that he had recently been declared bankrupt. The newspaper reports that he had been staying on sofas after falling into financial difficulty and had been staying on a friend's yacht in the Greek islands earlier this month. But due to concerns about his mental health, the friend arranged for Mr. Villiers to fly back to the UK and visit a clinic. Instead of going to the clinic, Mr. Villiers checked into the Durrance Hotel last Wednesday and took his own life the following day, according to The Times. Mr. Villiers, a distant cousin of Camilla, Duchess of Cornwall, had argued that as he and his estranged wife were divorcing in Scotland and should therefore have financial decisions decided in a Scottish court. Mr. Villiers, who is from Tinningham, East Lothian, also argued that the pair had lived in Scotland since their marriage in 1994. In Scotland, inherited wealth is not taken into account when dividing assets after a marriage breaks down, and maintenance payouts are also generally limited to just 3 years after a divorce is finalized. However, Mrs. Villiers moved to England following their separation. In England, divorce laws allow for financial support for the rest of claimants' lives. In a landmark decision, Supreme Court justices ruled against Mr. Villiers. The Supreme Court subsequently ruled that Mrs. Villiers, who had demanded a £3.5 million settlement from her former husband, could proceed with her application for maintenance in England. In March 2021, Mr. Justice Mostyn, of the High Court's Family Division, ruled that Mr. Villiers was heavily in debt and should not be required to pay maintenance. He stated that Mr. and Mrs. Villiers had been left financially ruined by the terrible litigation, and he suspected both were also psychologically damaged. But Mrs. Villiers persuaded Lord Justice Moylan, Lord Justice Colson and Lord Justice Arnold to overturn the ruling on appeal. The 3 judges decided that Mr. Justice Mostyn had been wrong to dismiss an application Mrs. Villiers made for maintenance. They had considered arguments at a Court of Appeal hearing in London in January and published a ruling in June this year and reached the clear conclusion that it had been wrong to dismiss Mrs. Villiers' application. Judges have heard how Mr. and Mrs. Villiers had lived at Milton House, a Georgian manor near Dumbarton, West Dunbartonshire. But the home was repossessed in 2015. At the most recent court hearing, Mr. Justice Mostyn said both Mr. and Mrs. Villiers had made accusations against the other after love turned to hatred. The court ordered that Mr. Villiers should pay his wife £10,000 a year in maintenance and had adjourned the case to see if he had benefited from his father's estate. Mr. Villiers, who is a distant cousin of Camilla on his mother's side, had been engaged to opera singer Heidi Innes, 45, but she ended their relationship in February this year. Miss Innes, who had been with Mr. Villiers for nearly 5 years, said, "It's over for good. I'm glad I didn't marry him officially. He's not the man I thought he was all this time. He's supposed to be a gentleman, but I don't think he has behaved very well." The couple were forced to leave their rented cottage in Tinningham in November after a tribunal ordered them to pay £18,000 in rent arrears run up during the COVID-19 pandemic. Following their departure from East Lothian, they moved to Budapest, in Hungary, where she had bought a small flat in 2020 with a view to it becoming a holiday let. Mr. Villiers' mother was Elizabeth Keppel, the daughter of Viscount Barry, the son of the 9th Earl of Albemarle. Her mother was Lady Mary Vane Tempest Stewart, the daughter of the 7th Marquess of Londonderry. His family home was Londonderry House, which was demolished in the 1960s to make way for the Londonderry Hotel in London's Park Lane. The site is now occupied by the Como Metropolitan. Mr. Villiers was a racehorse owner and primarily involved in the printing industry. At one point co-owned several local newspapers. However, after his marriage broke down, Mr. Villiers was declared bankrupt. His assets were seized and, although he was discharged from bankruptcy the following year, the family manor was repossessed in 2015.